Welcome to Frankly Speaking, the responsible business podcast produced by Frank Bold, the public interest European law firm. I'm Richard Howitt, and after many years leading discussion on responsible business issues inside the European Parliament, I lead our discussions of the latest developments in corporate sustainability, sustainable finance, business and human rights. Today, we come back to the EU's omnibus of sustainability directives on the day today, as this is issued, when a crucial vote is taken place in the Legal Affairs or JURI Committee of the European Parliament that will really signpost where this package is going in the future for businesses large and small. This last week has been a dramatic one, with the main centre-right grouping in the European Parliament threatening to vote with the far right to dismantle the entire package, only to lead to a last-minute compromise, but one which still sees all civil liability provisions scrapped from the legislation and which led to the resignation of the main centre-left negotiator, citing that she says the fundamental objectives of the legislation have been lost. If you're confused, and who isn't, Frankly Speaking provides a first chance to understand what this all means, with my guests, Frank Bold's own Senior Policy Officer, Julia Otten, and Assistant Dean and Professor of Business and Society at Copenhagen Business School, another old friend of the podcast, Andreas Rasche. Andreas, welcome to Frankly Speaking.
Thank you very much indeed, Richard. Pleasure to be here.
And Julia, a warm welcome too.
Yeah, nice to be back. Thanks.
Now, before we get to the detail of what was agreed, the context, we saw a breakdown of talks, threats and counter-threats, a compromise of sorts, then resignations. Before we get into the detail of what's agreed, it's been complete turmoil. What on earth has been happening? Andreas first.
Yes, well, thank you, Richard. I think, what has happened, I think, is that the EPP has put a lot of pressure, I think, on the other political parties. And pressure here is, I think, a very nice word. I would maybe call this more a threat that they go with the far right. And apparently it has worked, at least in that context. And this created a lot of the turmoil that we have seen, a lot of the back and forth in terms of the positions. And I must say the final outcome is, of course, disappointing in terms of content, but it's also disappointing in terms of process, because it kind of shows that the von der Leyen majority itself does not hold together to the degree, I think, that a lot of people would have hoped.
And Julia, what's your own comment on this? You follow in detail what's happening in Parliament. And, I heard stories about the centre-right grouping, European People's Party, EPP, people losing their committee places, losing their speaking time if they were going to move away from the centre-right position. I heard there were even lists of companies the EPP members of the European Parliament were told they shouldn't talk to because they had a different view from other business lobbying. Pretty central control from the top that is not usual in the European Parliament. How did you see it?
Yeah, this is not usual in the European Parliament. That's clear. There's high-level decision-making coming from the EPP that is pressuring their own group. So every member, they really try to keep everyone on that party line. There's very little room for discussion as we see it from the outside. I think there has been quite some discussions within the group, because not everyone is happy about what the rapporteur has proposed as negotiation tactics. And I fully agree with what Andreas said. This is concerning not just because what we see it's doing to the sustainability laws at stake, but it's far beyond that. It's very damaging for the democratic culture you have in the parliament. What does this mean? You don't negotiate a compromise, but you force other parties into a compromise by leaning to this anti-EU majority. I think that's very, very concerning, and it's unacceptable as a negotiation tactics in a democratic parliament. Yeah, and then on the sustainability laws itself, it also shows us that the rapporteur doesn't really care much about the laws as such. He cares about finding this majority or saving faces or following this overall line, but it's not so much about really looking at the technical details already putting two options out there saying I'm fine with both. I mean, what type of decision making is that? What do you stand for as an EPP? I think that's very difficult.
And I think the businesses and all our business listeners will be shocked to think that the future of sustainable business will be determined by extremist politicians, many of whom deny that climate change exists in the first place. And Lara Wolters, MEP, who was the MEP who resigned, she was quoted as saying that there was not a single decent conversation, only threats and theatre. And the Centre Renew group, Liberal MEP Pascal Confin, he said that he blames the European Commission putting a law together without proper consultation, without evidence that it will really simplify, without completely jeopardising the object of the regulation. So pretty hot words from the people in the end who were part of the so-called compromise. I've seen it described not as an omnibus, but an omnishambles. And I'm afraid that's how I would characterise it, a phrase that started in a political satire called The Thick of It, that some of our listeners will know. And in this case, reality was more satirical and more extreme than comedy. You could not make it up. So we've done the process. Let's do the content of what's been agreed, because many of our listeners want to hear that, but they also want to hear it explained. So first of all, Andreas, on the scope of CSRD, the reporting directive, it's 1,000 companies and 450 million euros turnover is the final agreement in the compromise. What's your response to that?
Well, I think it is absolutely not acceptable. I think it's, of course, it is by and large, or it is the position of the council. And in terms of employee threshold line, it is also the position of the commission. But there were many stakeholders throughout who kind of warned that this cut-off line, which, by the way, excludes 90% of companies from the CSRD. And Richard, I think that's something we really need to kind of process. 90%. So this is almost all of the companies.
Just on that point,
yeah.
Andreas, it was going to be nearly 50,000. It's now, I've seen different figures, but I've seen a figure of 4,000 under this. And the directive I myself helped pass in 2014, over a decade ago, was 11,000 companies. So we're saying, despite all of the extra climate change, all of the extra biodiversity loss in the last 10 years, we're going back to a position that is worse by 2/3 than Europe's position from 2014, a decade ago. I'm exasperated by that.
Yeah. I fully agree with you, Richard. I mean, there is a complete lack of regulatory consistency, and I think this is a key point here. We did the calculations. We kind of looked into how many companies will remain in scope, both for the due diligence and the CSRD. And for the CSRD, indeed, it will be around 4,700 companies. If you assume that 30% of subsidiaries will report, because there is the subsidiary exemption in there. But this is by far not enough. The European Central Bank has said it. Investors have said it. I myself have talked to many of my colleagues on the academic side. This is not enough to provide investors and also other stakeholders with the necessary data on social and environmental issues. So I think
on that point, Andreas, are investors just going to require information from lots of companies, other companies otherwise? The last minute investor statement with a huge number, Alliance and a huge number of investors say they wanted a threshold at 250, not 1,000. And, I myself have been part of the process by which companies were complaining that they had to report to CDP and all the different voluntary frameworks, and they wanted to get rid of that and have a single harmonised process. Are we going to go back to that so that companies in a year or two are going to be saying to lawmakers, we're still having to provide this information, even though you're not requiring us to, and it's more burdensome than if you'd have done the right thing in the first place?
Exactly. I mean, we are moving back into a world of voluntary disclosures, and most of all, also bilateral disclosures. We will see a lot of disclosures between companies and between buyers and suppliers. But all of this is probably not standardized very much because the frameworks will not be applied consistently. So in that sense, we are moving into a world of less transparency, less accountability, and I think the decision or the agreement that we have on the table and where we will likely land with the CSRD is absolutely not satisfactory, neither from the perspective of investors nor from the perspective of companies themselves. Because I always try to also explain to companies, you don't only do this for the investors, you also do it for yourself. How do you want to measure
Yes.
carbon emissions, or how do you want to manage carbon emissions if you don't measure them, right? I mean, this is practically impossible. So in that sense, I think it is important to recognize that this clearly is a step back.
Now, Julia, let's look at the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, CSDDD side of all of this. The scope is even bigger. You have to be 5,000 employees and a turnover of 1.5 billion euros. So it's only a very small number of large companies, 70% cut there compared with the proposal. What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I can start on a similar point as Andreas. The scope is really limiting the effects at scale that we will see on this law. And the assumption that this will trickle down is, I think, something we don't see in practice. And Andreas, correct me if I'm wrong, but also don't see in research. So it's problematic. It only tackles
Correct.
the very, very large ones. It's definitely France's handwriting, and we were very disappointed that the Parliament followed through and just took the same high scope, but didn't find a more reasonable approach or balanced approach on the scope as such. We're talking about roughly 1,600 companies. If you speak companies, if you look at groups, it's a slightly lower number. So that's very few companies. In a couple of member states, it basically is less than 10. And then in the overall package on CSDDD, we have to say that there is good language coming out of the Parliament on the risk-based approach as such. So this famous Article 8 on risk identification, that has really improved. That's closer to the international standards. That's good. That's correcting things that the Commission had started and the Council did not change much. We're concerned that we have still no harmonized regime on civil liability here. So both also in terms of the standard of application for companies, there is no clarity what you're judged upon when you're held liable across the EU. You have very different rules there still. From our perspective, that's not simplifying. And then also on
Can I just
climate.
unpick that? Can I just unpick those a bit? First of all, on numbers, I've read that in 13 of the 27 member states, it's less than 20 companies. So it really is very few.
Yes.
But your point about what in the jargon is called value chain cap, this idea that they have dropped now, that they only have to look at human rights and environmental risks in tier one suppliers. But as I understand it, that's tempered by the fact that they're only enabled to require information from other large companies, so that in smaller companies below 5,000 in the supply chain, it doesn't matter if there's a high risk of impact or high impact, you can't get the information. So in a way, it's a semi-win for the business and human rights campaigners, but in a way, it really isn't. How do you respond to that?
Well, we have to be clear that the obligation itself is still you do a scoping of your overall value chains, and you do need to look at indirect suppliers when there is indication, information that there could be severe risks and likely risks. So it's clearly expanding beyond the direct business partners. That's good. Now, the problem with the value chain cap, as we call it technically, is that we are concerned this restricts the information flow or the information exchange between businesses in a way that is practically not at all useful for doing good due diligence. Because what you want to see in due diligence is engagement with your suppliers to a certain degree. You need to engage with them in order to create more resilient supply chains, in order to ameliorate conditions in certain factories, etc. So this blanco language that comes from maybe wanting to protect SMEs creates other problems down the line and is just not looking at unintended consequences well enough. And that's our concern. And we have a similar concern on the CSRD side, where the value chain COP formulation is also very strict.
And on your point about civil liability, I recall business lobbying saying, actually, let's have a level playing field rather than different member states applying different rules in relation to civil liability. In plain terms, victims being able and claimants being able to take companies to court for non-compliance in relation to human rights and environmental risks that they suffer. So those businesses wanted civil liability in the EU framework to give them certainty in a level playing field. Are we just going to see a patchwork of different rules?
Well, what the tax still keeps is the requirement to have a civil liability regime. But the thing is, we have 27 different ways of civil law in the EU, and then what law judges are going to apply is even more, because you look at the law of where the damage was caused, etc. So you look at basically many jurisdictions across the world, depending on how and where you operate. So that just multiplies the possible rules of what judges could apply to judge upon whether you should have done due diligence or not, and what your duty of care looks like. So that's very complicated for companies to navigate from a legal perspective. And I think there is a lot of legal sense and business sense in terms of harmonizing this. And from my perspective, it was really just a very polarized decision making in the EPP to say we simply don't want civil liability, and so we will not move an inch on this, even not looking at the technical implications of that discussion. So it's too politicized in a way, I would say.
By the way, for anyone who thinks that we're biased, we're not. We're looking at it as specialists, and we've invited Jakob Vorburn, the rapporteur from the EPP, to come on the podcast if he accepts. We'll allow him to completely put his position, so we're not in any sense trying to stifle the debate on all of this. Andreas, climate transition plans. We all know that was a big issue within the discussions on the compromise. It started off with the European Commission saying that companies had to write a climate transition plan, but they had no responsibility to implement it, which I've said on this podcast many a time is completely absurd. There was a threat when there was seemingly going to be a far-right majority just to get rid of them altogether. There's now a different set of words again. Just tell us what your understanding is of what companies will be required to do in relation to climate transition plans.
Yeah, indeed, Richard. The wording is very weak in the compromise when you look at the climate transition plans. Lots of links towards implementation actions. All of this has been deleted. And I read out of this, of course, that it is more important that the plan exists as such, and this is also something that the Commission highlighted. But then, of course, the implementation and also the actions that actually belong to the plan, this is not as much highlighted as I would have at least expected it for these plans to be taken serious. So I think overall, of course, it is good that they were not completely deleted, right? This was also on the table, but at the end of the day, we need to ask ourselves, what is this worth now at the end of the day? It is good, I think, that there's a clause in there that companies need to update these plans, and there's some supervision on that. So all of that, I think, is good, but I would have wished for really a stronger focus on the actual implementation, on the actual actions that are required. Companies still also need to look into the investments that are linked. This is good, I think. We know this from also from a lot of business studies. Whenever you need to kind of disclose investments related to such plans, you're more likely to actually act on them. But overall, I think it is not what I would have wished for, and in a sense, I think there is a risk here that we might end up with a paper tiger that has not as much effect as people wanted to have.
And because the requirement for climate transition plans is in the CSDDD part of the Omnibus, it's very much affected by the reduced scope. So many fewer companies being required to move towards having a climate transition plan.
Exactly.
And I predict many more will do than they're required to, because the logic is there. Yeah, Julia, one of the dogs that hasn't barked is the whole issue of third country and extraterritorial application. We know very well that the recent EU-US trade agreement has opened up a whole discussion between the European Commission and the US to shelve some of the extraterritorial application of these laws, but it's not been subject to really detailed negotiation in the European Parliament at the moment. Is this going to arrive on the scene, and how's that issue going to play going forward, do you think?
Well, I don't know if I would agree that it hasn't arrived at the
Right.
scene, actually. It's just played good tactics not to be maybe too visible in some ways. I think it's there. The pressure is huge. We can see this not just on the trade angle that was picked up by a lot of media reporting. I think what we generally see, and there was a good research published last week on Exxon's lobbying strategies on the CSDDD very specifically. And it's interesting to see their ways of trying to influence the law and how much they've achieved actually in terms of their original proposals and calls. What we will really see in November in trialogue is that this will even increase. So I'm sure, and I think many of us could predict that there will be more pressure coming from the US, not just against the scope, US companies being in scope. Now, again, that's a small number that we're talking about here, right, with this scope, but also around the climate transition plans. We've seen this by ExxonMobil, by other oil and gas companies, etc., but maybe also around the Article 8. We see this coming from Qatar, from China. But the question to EU lawmakers is really, do they want to give in to this geopolitical pressure, or do they want to care about what they see as best interest for the EU single market and for the European companies that are arguably more advanced maybe on energy efficiency, on some of the things? So these laws are seen as protectionist measures by some of these regimes for a reason. And the question is, do European lawmakers, both in the capitals, because it comes to the Council again in trilogues, and in the Parliament, really stand up for these interests, and do they defend them? And I very much hope so, but I think it will be there will be very high pressure on the EU.
I agree with that. And in these directives first time around, the fact that other companies from outside Europe had to comply as a condition of access to the single market was really important for lawmakers, because of the whole accusation that this could be anti-competitive for European companies. And so it would be a huge volte-face if the European members of Parliament were to suddenly cave in, and it would be anti the competitiveness of European firms, which they claim to want to defend. So like you, I'm watching this space, and I expect it to grow. And by the way, to all our listeners, we're going to have a special podcast shortly on the EU-US agreement and its implications for sustainability. So watch out for that shortly. Now, in that answer, Skelia, yes, you wanted to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one short comment, because there was a proposal coming from the rapporteur, Jürgen Orban, in the parliamentary discussions around the scope. And there was one proposal where he suggested to higher the scope, so even allowing non-European companies, big Chinese companies, etc., to not comply with these standards, which would put European companies at a competitive disadvantage in that regard. And I think it shows how, it speaks for itself. It's unacceptable, I think, if we don't set the same standards for everyone selling goods here in the market in terms of what we see coming in from as imports, etc.
And just to give an example of that, on Wednesday of last week, Chancellor Merz of Germany talked with the Spanish Prime Minister, who comes from the Socialist and Democrat family, and put pressure via them on the Socialist and Democrat group, centre-left group in the European Parliament, to cave in. And that shows that national capitals are really pushing hard, and it's national interests rather than European interests that are really gearing that. In that answer, Yulia, you talked about the trilogue, I know we will have some listeners who are not familiar with the sort of internal European processes. So just to say, after plenary, it will, having been voted then, and we would expect the compromise agreed today to stick, then it will go into a negotiating process where the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the member states, the government representatives from the European Council, go into this trilogue where they negotiate with each other a compromise between all of them. Now, that trilogue is going to be chaired by the current presidency of the EU, Denmark. Andreas, you're sitting in Denmark. You don't speak for the Danish government, but I think you've got a close eye, let's say, on what they might do as the presidency. What's your feel for how the trilogue process will go?
Well, I think the Danish presidency is, of course, committed to a speedy trilogue. They highlighted that a couple of times, and also to kind of managing this in a professional way. I do not think that we can expect from Denmark that they would kind of push in any direction that would kind of lower some of the standards or kind of change some of the amendments. I think they are mostly interested in concluding this process on time, which means by the end of 2025. And I think this is what I've heard, and I think this is what we can expect.
And I've seen the draft dates for the trialogue. They finish on the 8th of December. There's a feeling that this is all going to be put to bed by Christmas. Everything I've heard concurs with what you've just said. On scope, the scope put forward by the European Commission on CSRD was a much lower level on turnover compared with what's been agreed in the Parliament and the Council in terms of their positions, or what will be agreed in the Parliament. But I have to say, because so many of the positions in the Parliament are the same as those in the Council, I can't really see the Commission sticking out for more stringent standards, which they'd have to do if they were loyal to their own original position. And therefore, to me, I think in the trilogue, we can expect the positions which concur in so many ways between Council and Parliament to stick. Would you agree with that analysis?
I would very much agree. I think the two co-legislators here, the Parliament and the Council, I think they will set the tone, and particularly on scope, I think we will likely settle around for the CSDD, the 1.5 billion. So this is rather consistent. And then also on the CSRD, the 1,000 employee, 450 million. I think I don't think there will be too many discussions around this. I cannot imagine, that the Commission will challenge that, particularly also because in terms of the CSRD scoping, the Commission kind of proposed a system where you still have three criteria. You have balance sheet, you have net turnover, and you have employees. And of course, the Council and Parliament propose a much simpler solution, which in a process where you talk about simplification might also be the more attractive choice.
Let's just talk a bit about what businesses and other stakeholders should be doing now. There's been a lot of uncertainty and confusion. Hopefully we're helping solve that a bit in what we say today, even if it's people will have different views about how good or bad these outcomes are. But there'll be some of our listeners who will say, at least we're going to have certainty. We're going to know by Christmas what this is going to mean going forward. And the uncertainty is very costly for us as well. But that makes business sort of passive observers, really, when I think this podcast and Frank Bold has been very much saying, get involved, make your voice heard. So at this crucial moment in the process, before it's all done and dusted, what message would both of you give to businesses? Julia first, please.
Yeah, again and again, I know it's a long stretch for them as well, and it's a lot of ups and downs following this and staying on top of speed. But knowing that it'll be over hopefully by the end of the year, I think that we really need them in November to raise their voices, to get more diverse voices, to really support the risk-based approach on due diligence, to support the climate plans, because there will be a lot of pushback, and they are very much needed to safeguard some of these, some of these good elements that we see on the table.
Same question to you, Andreas.
Well, I think businesses now, I think, need to reflect. Because a lot of them, they will be out of scope of these regulations. So I think they need to reflect on where and how do we go ahead. What we've seen in February when the Commission came with the proposal was a lot of very hasty actions on the business side. A lot of businesses said immediately, we don't report any longer, and so on. So I think what we now need is really honest reflection on the business side. Can we really afford not to report? Can we afford not to do due diligence? Because I think with the Omnibus now, these discussions, unfortunately, around voluntary action become again more important. So I think this is a call to businesses also to have these reflections, to have these debates in boardrooms, among executive teams, also within sustainability teams. So I think there is, of course, action on the policy level, but we also need action within the companies because wait and see doesn't work any longer. As you say, Richard, I mean, we are moving towards the trilogue, and the entire process is likely to be finished by the end of 2025. So I think companies now really need to make up their mind where they stand and where they want to go.
And can I say I agree with that. I think, I talk to companies and what I believe is that the report CSRD and CSDDD will become the benchmark, whether you actually inside the scope or not. Good reporting and good due diligence will be defined what are inside those laws. And so there's going to be an incentive for companies who are thinking about what they want to do, who probably want to do the right thing, but want to know how, to use this as a template, whether you're in scope or not. People can criticize that point of view and say, well, it's just about trying to get it back in through the back door. And I'm aware that there can be a criticism of that. But nevertheless, if, as we've heard over and over again in the last months, companies want certainty, that can give them certainty if they follow those methodologies. And by the way, that includes the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, ESRS, that are mandated under the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which we've not talked about in detail in this programme, but there's a recent podcast explaining the new simplified standards produced there. So please feel free to go back and look at it. We're moving towards the end of our discussion, and I want to ask both of you, the EU Green Deal, it was the aspiration of von der Leyen in her first term. It was the aspiration of the European Union that Europe could lead the green transition in the world, a transition that many people say is going on. And the question is who gets there first in terms of the greatest competitiveness. And is absolutely essential if we are going to combat climate change and uphold sustainability principles. Von der Leyen and the new Commission, when they brought in the Omnibus, they said, we want to simplify, but we don't want to prejudice the objectives of the Green Deal. What's our objective belief on whether the Green Deal is still alive today or not? Julia first.
Well, big question. I think von der Leyen has changed her wording to really pick up on deregulation and calling it deregulation herself. So that's an indication, I think, and that reflects the reality from my perspective. I'm very concerned. I think the risks and both on climate environmental side and the human rights violations continue. Businesses, as Andreas said, have to make up their mind of how to tackle this and how to address this. The question is how much do we give them clarity through the legal frameworks and through the governance frameworks, etc. And I think it's very unfortunate if the EU backtracks on this ambition to really provide clear, harmonized, standardized guardrails for its EU market and its companies. But that's the track we're on at the moment. So, yeah, it's unfortunate. It's really it's rolling us back. There is going to be more voluntary action around this, as Andreas said. Full stop.
Yes, deregulation, full stop. Yes, no. I mean, is the Green Deal still alive? Well, I think it is still alive, but it's certainly not thriving anymore. I think what we've seen in the first von der Leyen term was certainly the Green Deal was thriving. The Green Deal was the anchor, and this is certainly gone. What I'm most concerned with is that the impact logic of the Green Deal is significantly undermined by the first omnibus package. The impact logic was always we provide transparency on financial markets. We provide them with good, reliable, quality data. This then helps investors to reallocate capital towards the kind of green sectors. With the omnibus package that we just discussed in this podcast and the changes to it, we will not see the same data available to investors anymore. Investors are very concerned about this. Hence, my fear is that we will undermine the long-term objectives of the Green Deal simply because capital allocation by the private sector will be not as smooth as we actually think it should be. So I'm quite skeptical, I must say, about the future of the Green Deal. I know von der Leyen always says, Wopke Hoekstra and others always say the objectives stand. But I also see some discussions actually on the objectives. I mean, we have this debate around the 2040 climate goal and the 2035 goal and decoupling of both and so on. So I think we really need to get our act together to kind of also be honest about the implications, the significant implications of this Omnibus One simplification package. And yes, it is deregulation and not just simplification. And I'm glad that Mrs. von der Leyen acknowledges this as well.
I think that's a guarded comment, let's say a compliment, but I think our listeners will understand it. The next fight, by the way, is over the 2040 climate target for the European Union. And some say that this majority was essential to try and safeguard that. We shall see, and we'll report on it in this podcast. In this podcast, we've heard that on CSRD, the reporting directive, that there's going to continue to be a lot of reporting according to voluntary frameworks and investor demands that's non-comparable, and watch that argument come back over the next year or two. We've heard that there's going to be even fewer companies in scope for human rights due diligence, and that the value chain cap, whilst the outcome is to a degree welcome, the risk-based approach is supported. There's a lot of in the detail of how companies should map and engage with their suppliers that could still be affected in the trialogue process. We've heard that civil liability, just like reporting, is going to be determined by a patchwork between different member states. The liability is not going to go. The understanding and the level playing field for that is what's being dispensed with. And we've heard that the dog has barked on the requirement for third country companies to have their voices heard in terms of deregulation, but that we expect that those voices to be even intensified during the trialogue process. Is the Green Deal still alive? Deregulation, full stop, is what Julia said to us, and it's difficult not to agree with that. We have come to the end of our podcast. The two colleagues with me are two great friends and colleagues. Thank you so much for being with here and explaining all of this to our audience, to Julia Otten and to Andreas Rasche. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard.
Thank you, Richard and Andreas.
You've been listening to Frankly Speaking, the Frank Bold podcast on responsible business. Find out more about Frank Bold's Responsible Companies section on our website, and please give us your feedback on our LinkedIn page or by commenting via your podcast provider, where we hope you will share this conversation and give this podcast a 5-star rating. And remember, you can watch us on our YouTube channel too. Thank you again to Julia, to Andreas, and to all of you for listening. Do join us next time, and goodbye.